In the grand halls of Buckingham Palace, where protocol reigns supreme and tradition runs deeper than the Thames, one moment of defiance would change everything. Colonel Marcus Thornfield had commanded respect on battlefields across 3 continents, but nothing had prepared him for what would happen when he decided to test the limits of his authority. Against a silent sentinel in a red coat and bearskin hat, what started as a display of military dominance would become a lesson in humility that thousands would witness and millions would never forget. Sometimes the most powerful victories come not from those who shout the loudest, but from those who stand the quietest. The crowd gathered that crisp autumn morning had no idea they were about to witness a confrontation that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and the true meaning of duty. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as tourists began their daily pilgrimage to witness the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Among them stood Colonel Marcus Thornfield, a decorated officer recently returned from a challenging deployment in Afghanistan. His chest bore the weight of numerous medals, each one telling a story of courage, leadership, and unwavering dedication to his country. Thornfield had spent the better part of 2 decades climbing the military hierarchy, earning respect through decisive action and uncompromising authority. His soldiers knew him as a man who demanded excellence and got results. In the harsh landscapes of foreign battlefields, his word was law, and his presence commanded immediate attention from both subordinates and fellow officers. But today was different. Today, he found himself among civilians, tourists with cameras and guidebooks, all eager to catch a glimpse of the iconic Royal Guards. Thornfield had visited the palace many times before, but always in an official capacity, always with the proper protocols and military courtesies that governed such occasions. This time he was simply another observer, though his military bearing made him stand out among the crowd like a hawk among pigeons. As he adjusted his civilian jacket, Thornfield couldn't help but notice how the tourists seemed almost reverent in their approach to the palace grounds. They whispered among themselves, pointed excitedly at the uniformed guards, and maintained a respectful distance that spoke to the awe these silent sentinels inspired. For a moment he found himself genuinely curious about what it would be like to serve in such a role. Standing motionless for hours, becoming a living symbol of tradition and duty, the Royal Guards, members of the elite household division, had been protecting British monarchs for centuries. Their distinctive red tunics and towering bearskin hats made them instantly recognizable around the world, but their role went far beyond mere ceremony. These were highly trained soldiers, many of whom had served in active combat zones, now entrusted with the sacred duty of protecting the royal family and maintaining the dignity of the crown. Guardsman James Mitchell had been standing at his post outside the palace gates for nearly an hour. At 24 years old, he had already completed 2 tours of duty, first in Iraq and later in Afghanistan, where he had earned commendations for his bravery under fire. But here, in the heart of London, his battlefield was different. His enemy was not insurgents or hostile forces, but the constant temptation to break protocol, to acknowledge the taunts of tourists, or to react to the endless stream of attempts to make him smile, laugh, or move. The morning had been typical so far. Tourists had posed for photographs beside him, children had waved enthusiastically, and the occasional joker had tried to make him break character with silly faces or inappropriate comments. Mitchell had remained as still as the stone lions that adorned the palace gates, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing controlled and steady. This was his duty, and he took it as seriously as any mission he had undertaken in foreign lands. Colonel Thornfield found himself drawn to this particular guard. There was something in the young man's posture, in the way he held himself, that spoke of genuine military discipline. Unlike many of the tourists around him, Thornfield recognized the real effort it took to maintain such composure, especially under the constant scrutiny of hundreds of curious onlookers. As the morning progressed, the crowd began to swell in anticipation of the changing of the guard ceremony. Families positioned themselves for the best views, tour guides gathered their groups, and the excitement in the air became almost palpable. It was then that Thornfield noticed something that began to irritate him deeply. A group of teenagers had been testing the limits of appropriate behavior, gradually becoming more bold in their attempts to provoke a reaction from Guardsman Mitchell. They started with harmless jokes and silly poses, but as their confidence grew, so did their audacity. They began making loud comments about the guard's appearance, speculating about whether he was real or a wax figure, and even suggesting increasingly inappropriate ways to test his resolve. What bothered Thornfield most was not just their behavior, but the way other tourists seemed to find it entertaining. Cameras came out, capturing what they perceived as harmless fun. Adults smiled indulgently at the teenagers' antics, and some even encouraged them with laughter and applause. To Thornfield, this represented everything that was wrong with civilian attitudes toward military service and tradition. The colonel had spent his career in environments where respect for authority was not just expected but essential for survival. In his world, discipline meant the difference between life and death, and the chain of command was sacred. Watching these tourists treat a serving soldier as nothing more than a tourist attraction began to stir something dark and angry within him. He found himself studying Guardsman Mitchell more closely, looking for any sign that the young soldier was struggling with the situation. But the guard remained perfectly still, his face betraying nothing. His eyes focused on some distant point beyond the crowd. If the provocations were affecting him, he gave no indication whatsoever. This display of self-control only served to fuel Thornfield's growing sense of injustice. Here was a young man, possibly a combat veteran like himself, being subjected to public humiliation for the entertainment of people who had never worn a uniform or faced genuine danger. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that someone needed to step forward and restore proper order to the situation. As the teenagers' behavior escalated, with one of them now making exaggerated marching motions and mimicking the guard's stance in an obviously mocking manner, Thornfield felt his military training kick in. In his mind, this had moved beyond harmless tourism into the realm of disrespect for military service itself. Someone needed to take charge, to restore the dignity that these civilians clearly didn't understand or appreciate. The colonel began to move through the crowd, his bearing automatically shifting into the commanding presence that had served him so well throughout his career. Other tourists seemed to sense his authority and unconsciously stepped aside as he approached the area where Guardsman Mitchell stood. Thornfield could feel his pulse quickening, not with nervousness, but with the familiar surge of adrenaline that came before taking decisive action. He had no official authority here, no jurisdiction over either the tourists or the guard, but Colonel Marcus Thornfield had never been one to let technicalities stop him from doing what he believed was right. In his mind, the situation was simple. A fellow soldier was being disrespected, proper military bearing was being mocked, and the civilians present either couldn't or wouldn't address the problem themselves. As he drew closer to Guardsman Mitchell's position, Thornfield began formulating his approach. He would use the same tone and bearing that had brought unruly soldiers into line countless times before. He would demonstrate proper respect for military authority and, in doing so, show these tourists how they should behave in the presence of a serving soldier. The crowd around him continued their various activities, unaware that they were about to witness something that would challenge their assumptions about authority, respect, and the true nature of military discipline. Colonel Thornfield was about to learn a lesson that no amount of battlefield experience had prepared him for. And Guardsman Mitchell was about to demonstrate that sometimes the greatest strength comes from knowing exactly when not to use it. The stage was set for a confrontation that would surprise everyone present, not because of the noise it would make, but because of the profound silence that would follow. Colonel Thornfield positioned himself directly in front of Guardsman Mitchell, his military bearing evident in every line of his posture. The tourists around them began to take notice, sensing that something different was about to happen. Cameras that had been casually capturing the scene now focused with more intent, and conversations gradually died down as people realized that this man was not just another tourist trying to get a reaction from the guard the colonel cleared, his throat and began to speak in the commanding voice that had echoed across parade grounds from Sandhurst to